The wealthy CEO laughed as she pointed at the police officer standing awkwardly near the back of the school auditorium. Her voice dripped with contempt as she issued her challenge loud enough for everyone to hear. Surely even a police officer can play a simple tune on the piano. Or is that beyond your skill set? The other parents, all dressed in designer clothes and dripping with jewelry, snickered behind their champagne glasses. They looked at James Carter, the single father, in his worn but clean button-down shirt, like he was some sort of amusing curiosity. A cop at their exclusive fundraiser. How quaint. But Victoria Sinclair, the real estate mogul who'd made her fortune flipping luxury properties, had no idea who she was really challenging. She didn't know that the quiet man she was mocking, the humble police officer she was trying to humiliate, had once been called a prodigy. She didn't know that his name had once been spoken in the same breath as the great concert pianists. What happened next would leave everyone in that room speechless. What happened next would teach Victoria Sinclair the most expensive lesson of her life. And what happened next would show a little 8-year-old girl named Lily just how extraordinary her father truly was. This is the story of how one moment at a piano changed everything. The evening had started innocently enough. James Carter had arrived at Riverside Elementary's annual charity gala with his daughter Lily, her small hand tucked safely in his larger one. The event was being held in the school's auditorium, transformed for the night into something that resembled a country club ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, white tablecloths covered every surface, and servers in black vests circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that James couldn't pronounce. Riverside Elementary was one of the best schools in the district. It was also one of the most expensive. James had stretched every dollar of his police salary to afford the tuition, working overtime shifts and extra details whenever he could. He did it because Lily deserved the best education he could give her. He did it because that's what fathers do. But as he walked through the crowd that evening, James felt the weight of 1,000 judgmental stares. The other parents were tech executives, doctors, lawyers, and business owners. They drove luxury cars and lived in houses with circular driveways. James drove a 10-year-old Ford sedan and lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. He didn't belong here, and they made sure he knew it. Lily tugged on his sleeve, her bright eyes looking up at him with concern. "Daddy, why is everyone staring?" James squeezed her hand gently. "They're just curious, sweetie. Don't worry about it." But Lily was 8 years old, and she was smart enough to understand what curious really meant. She'd seen the way some of the other kids treated her at school. She'd heard the whispers about her father being just a cop, about them living in an apartment instead of a house, about her wearing clothes from Target instead of boutique stores. The event's organizer, a perky woman named Mrs. Henderson, approached them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Officer Carter, so glad you could make it. The donation table is over there." She gestured vaguely toward a corner before gliding away to greet a couple who'd just arrived in what looked like matching Rolex watches. James guided Lily to their assigned table near the back of the room. Most of the other seats were empty. Apparently, not many people wanted to sit with the cop. They had barely settled into their chairs when Victoria Sinclair made her entrance. Victoria was impossible to miss. She swept into the room like she owned it, which in a way she did. Her company had donated a significant sum to the school's building fund, and she never let anyone forget it. She was tall, blonde, and draped in what James estimated was probably $20,000 worth of jewelry and designer clothing. Her heels clicked authoritatively against the floor as she moved through the crowd, accepting greetings like a queen receiving her subjects. Her son Bradley trailed behind her, looking uncomfortable in his tailored suit. Bradley was in Lily's class, And while he'd never been outright cruel to her, he'd never been particularly kind either. He was one of those kids who went along with whatever the popular crowd was doing. Victoria's eyes swept across the room and landed on James. Her expression shifted just slightly. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just spotted something amusing. She changed course, heading directly toward their table. James felt Lily tense beside him. "Officer Carter Victoria," said her voice, carrying across several nearby tables. "How unexpected to see you here. I didn't realize officers could afford Riverside's tuition." The conversations at nearby tables quieted. People were listening. James kept his voice level. "Evening, Mrs. Sinclair. Lily's education is important to me." "How noble," Victoria said, and somehow she made nobility sound like an insult. "It must require so many extra shifts, so much overtime. Doesn't leave much time for actually parenting, does it?" Lily's face flushed red. James felt anger flare in his chest, but he forced it down. He'd dealt with worse on the streets. He could handle one entitled CEO. "I make time for what matters," he said quietly. Victoria laughed, a crystalline sound that cut through the air. "Of course you do." She turned to the parents at the nearby tables, including them in her performance. "It's so important that we have diversity at these events. All different kinds of people, even those in more humble professions." The way she said humble made it clear she meant something else entirely. Several parents nodded their faces, arranged in expressions of polite agreement. One woman, wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country, whispered something to her husband. They both looked at James and smirked. James felt Lily shrinking in her chair beside him, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. That hurt worse than any insult Victoria could throw at him. Before he could respond, the principal, Mr. Harrison, took the stage and welcomed everyone to the evening's event. The fundraiser would include a silent auction dinner and entertainment provided by some of the school's talented students and their families. Victoria returned to her prominent table at the front of the room, but not before giving James one last disdainful look. She'd marked her territory. She'd reminded everyone who belonged here and who didn't. What she didn't know was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Dinner was served. Chicken that probably cost $50 a plate, but tasted like it had been sitting under heat lamps for too long. James ate mechanically, making sure Lily ate something, even though she seemed to have lost her appetite. Around them, the other parents chatted about their vacation homes in Aspen, their children's private tennis coaches, their upcoming trips to Europe. They spoke just loud enough for James to hear, painting a picture of a world so different from his own it might as well have been on another planet. A woman at the next table, draped in pearls and superiority, turned to her companion and said, "I just don't understand the school's scholarship program. I mean, standards are standards for a reason, aren't they?" Her friend nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. We pay full tuition so our children can be around the right sort of people. If they let just anyone in..." James gripped his fork a little tighter, but said nothing. Lily had stopped eating entirely, her eyes fixed on her plate. After dinner, the entertainment portion of the evening began. Mr. Harrison returned to the stage, all smiles and enthusiasm. "And now we have a special treat. Some of our families have graciously agreed to share their talents with us tonight. First up, we have Bradley Sinclair performing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major." Victoria stood beaming as Bradley made his way to the grand piano, positioned at the side of the stage. The boy looked nervous, but he sat down at the bench with practiced ease. This wasn't his first public performance. The room fell quiet as Bradley began to play. James had to admit the kid wasn't bad. He'd clearly had lessons, probably expensive ones. His technique was clean, his timing mostly accurate, But there was something mechanical about it, like he was playing notes rather than music. It was competent, professional even, but it lacked soul. Still, when Bradley finished, the room erupted in applause. Victoria stood clapping loudly, her face glowing with pride. Several parents stood as well, giving the boy a standing ovation that seemed excessive for what had been a decent but not extraordinary performance. "Brilliant," someone shouted. "Wonderful," called another. Victoria soaked it all in her smile, triumphant. As Bradley returned to his seat, she stood and addressed the room. "Thank you all so much. Bradley has been studying piano since he was 4 years old. We believe in investing in our children's education in all its forms. Music, art, culture. These are the things that separate the truly refined from the ordinary." Her eyes found James across the room. The implication was clear. More parents shared their talents or their children's talents. There was a violin performance, a poetry reading, even a magic trick. Each act was met with enthusiastic applause. Each performer congratulated and praised. Then Victoria stood again. She moved to the center of the room, commanding attention with her presence alone. "This has been such a wonderful evening. So much talent in one room. It really shows the caliber of families we have here at Riverside." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience before landing once again on James. "Of course, talent comes in many forms, doesn't it? Some of us have classical training, refined skills passed down through generations of education and culture." Her smile sharpened. "Others have more practical abilities. Officer Carter, for instance. I'm sure you have many talents useful in your line of work. Self-defense, perhaps. Issuing traffic tickets." Scattered laughter rippled through the room. James felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. Lily grabbed his hand under the table, her small fingers trembling. Victoria continued warming to her theme. "But we shouldn't make assumptions, should we? Just because someone works a blue-collar job doesn't mean they lack culture. I'm sure Officer Carter appreciates the arts just as much as the rest of us." More laughter, now louder. James saw several parents exchange knowing looks, enjoying the show. "Tell me, Officer Carter," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "do you have any hidden talents you'd like to share? Can you recite poetry? Paint? Or perhaps—" She gestured toward the piano. "Perhaps you play an instrument." The room held its breath, waiting for his response. This was entertainment now. The out-of-place cop being put in his place. Humiliation disguised as inclusion. James felt the anger building, but beneath it was something else. A memory distant, but sharp. The feel of ivory keys under his fingers. The sound of music filling a concert hall. A life he'd left behind so long ago it felt like someone else's story. He looked down at Lily. Her eyes were filled with tears she was trying not to shed. His brave little girl trying so hard to be strong while the world told her she and her father weren't good enough. In that moment, James made a decision. He stood up his chair, scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. Every eye in the room fixed on him. "Actually, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I do play piano." Victoria's smile widened, scenting blood in the water. "Oh, how delightful. Then you simply must perform for us. After all, we'd hate to leave anyone out of our little talent show." James nodded slowly. "If you'd like." "I insist," Victoria said, gesturing magnanimously toward the piano. "Please share your talents with us." As James walked toward the piano, he heard the whispers start. He heard someone say, "This should be good," followed by suppressed laughter. He heard another person whisper, "Poor man. He has no idea how out of his depth he is." But they were wrong. They had no idea who was really out of their depth. James reached the piano, and stood beside it for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the glossy black surface. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway Grand, probably worth more than he made in a year. He hadn't touched a piano in 8 years. 8 long years of silence. The auditorium was completely quiet now, everyone waiting to see what would happen. Victoria had returned to her seat, but she was still smiling, still confident in her superiority. This was just another moment of entertainment for her, another opportunity to remind everyone of the natural order of things. James sat down at the bench. The familiar position felt strange after so long. His hands hovered over the keys, and for a moment doubt crept in. What if he couldn't do it? What if the muscle memory was gone? What if 8 years of not playing had eroded the skills he'd once possessed? He glanced back at Lily. She was watching him with wide eyes, hope and fear mixed in equal measure. Whatever happened next would affect her, not him. These people's opinions of him didn't matter, but their treatment of his daughter did. That's when Victoria spoke again, unable to resist one more twist of the knife. Perhaps something simple, Officer Carter. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself. I'm sure you know chopsticks, or maybe Mary had a little lamb. Laughter erupted across the room. Not polite chuckles anymore, but genuine laughter. The cop was going to play, and it was going to be a disaster, and they were all going to get to watch. One of Victoria's friends, a woman named Patricia, who owned a chain of boutiques, called out, "Maybe he can play the theme song from his favorite TV show." More laughter. Someone else made a joke about sirens and handcuffs. The entire room had turned into a scene of collective mockery, all directed at one man who'd dared to be different, to be less than them. James felt something shift inside him. Not anger anymore. Something colder, something more focused. He turned to Victoria, his expression calm. "What would you like me to play?" Mrs. Sinclair, Victoria, waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, anything you'd like. Whatever you think you can manage." "No," James said quietly. "I'm asking what you would like to hear. You issued the challenge. You choose the piece." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment. There was something in James's tone, something in his eyes that gave her pause. But then her confidence returned. After all, what could a cop possibly play that would impress anyone here? "Very well," she said, standing to address the room. "Bradley played Chopin earlier. That's intermediate level, but challenging enough. Perhaps you could try something similar. Say," she pretended to think her finger tapping against her chin, "Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. That's one of the more famous pieces. Surely if you play piano, you know it." A few people in the audience gasped. Harrison, the principal, looked uncomfortable. Even Patricia seemed surprised. "Victoria?" She whispered, "That piece is extremely difficult." Victoria shrugged her eyes, never leaving James. "Well, if Officer Carter truly plays piano, he should be able to handle it. Unless he'd prefer to admit he was exaggerating his abilities." The Prelude in C-sharp minor was one of Rachmaninoff's most challenging compositions. It required technical mastery, powerful dynamics, and perfect control. Most advanced pianists struggled with it. For someone claiming to play casually, it would be impossible. Victoria was setting James up for public humiliation. She was ensuring that when he failed, and surely he would fail, the lesson would be unmistakable. "Know your place? Stay in your lane. Don't pretend to be something you're not." James nodded slowly. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. "All right." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Wonderful. Please proceed. We're all eager to hear your interpretation." James turned back to the piano. His hands hovered over the keys. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable disaster. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor had once been James's signature piece. He'd performed it at his debut recital at the age of 16. He'd played it at his Juilliard audition. He'd played it the last night he ever touched a piano 8 years ago, the night before he walked away from music forever. The piece was more than notes to him. It was his past, his dreams, his father's pride, and his own broken heart all rolled into one. His fingers touched the keys and the first chord rang out. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor filled the auditorium. Deep, powerful, ominous. The famous three-note motif that had been described as the sound of church bells echoing across the Russian landscape. James played the first phrase, and the entire room went still. The laughter died. The smirks faded. Every person in that auditorium suddenly realized they were hearing something unexpected. James's fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision. The muscle memory was still there, buried, but not forgotten. 8 years vanished in an instant. His hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The music swelled, dramatic and intense. The prelude wasn't a gentle piece. It was powerful, demanding, filled with dark beauty and technical challenges that separated amateurs from masters, and James was playing it perfectly. Victoria's smile had frozen on her face. She was sitting at her table, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, staring at James like she was seeing a ghost. Patricia leaned over and whispered, Is he actually playing this?" Bradley watched from his seat, his mouth slightly open. He'd studied piano for years with expensive teachers, and he knew exactly how difficult this piece was. He'd tried to learn it once and given up after a few weeks. It was beyond him. But this cop, this man his mother had been mocking all evening, was playing it like it was as natural as breathing. James continued through the first section, his fingers flying across the keys in the rapid passages, then slowing for the contemplative middle section. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was feeling them. Each phrase carried weight, emotion, story. This was the language he'd once spoken fluently. This was the world he'd once belonged to before duty and responsibility had pulled him away. Mr. Harrison stood at the side of the room, his eyes wide. He'd been principal at Riverside for 15 years. He'd heard countless performances at school events. He'd never heard anything like this. The music teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been chatting with friends near the back, had stopped mid-sentence and moved closer to the piano. Her trained ear recognized what was happening. This wasn't a hobbyist playing a challenging piece. This was professional-level performance, concert level. James reached the climax of the first major section, his hands spanning the keyboard in powerful chords. The sound filled every corner of the auditorium, rich and commanding. Then suddenly he stopped. His hands lifted from the keys. The silence that followed was deafening. James sat there for a moment, his head bowed, his shoulders tense. Then he stood up from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. "I apologize," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I'm a bit rusty. It's been a long time." The room was absolutely silent. No one knew what to say. What they'd just heard was extraordinary, but James had stopped before finishing the piece. The interruption had been abrupt, almost painful. James walked back toward his table, every eye following him. Lily jumped up and grabbed his hand, her face shining with a mixture of pride and confusion. "Daddy, that was beautiful. Why did you stop?" James knelt down beside her, speaking quietly. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the past is better left in the past." But Victoria wasn't done. She couldn't leave it alone. Her entire power play had been disrupted, her humiliation of James transformed into something else entirely. She needed to regain control of the situation. She stood her voice sharp. "Well, that was interesting, though stopping in the middle is hardly a proper performance, is it?" She forced a laugh. "I suppose when you only play, occasionally, completing difficult pieces is challenging." A few people laughed nervously, but the sound was hollow. Everyone had heard what James played. They couldn't unhear it. James didn't respond. He sat back down with Lily, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm was building. Memories were flooding back, painful and sharp. The past he'd locked away was breaking free, and he wasn't sure he could push it back down. What no one in that room knew was that James hadn't stopped because he couldn't finish. He'd stopped because if he continued, if he let himself fall back into that music, he might not be able to climb back out. The piano had once been his entire world, and losing that world had nearly destroyed him. 23 years earlier, in a small house on the south side of Chicago, a 5-year-old boy named James Carter pressed his tiny fingers against the keys of an old upright piano his father had bought at a yard sale for $50. The piano was battered and out of tune, but to James, it was magic. He'd heard music coming from a neighbor's apartment one day and had become obsessed. He begged his father to let him try to make those sounds, those beautiful patterns that hung in the air like spells. Robert Carter was a police officer, working long hours to support his family. Money was tight. But when he saw the light in his son's eyes, the pure joy on his face, as those small fingers found notes and chords, Robert knew this was important. He found a retired piano teacher in the neighborhood, Mrs. Chen, who agreed to give James lessons for whatever the Carters could afford. Some weeks that was $20. Some weeks it was $5. Mrs. Chen never complained. She recognized talent when she saw it, and James had talent, extraordinary talent. By the time he was 7, James could play pieces that most teenagers struggled with. By 9, he'd won his first competition performing at the Chicago Youth Music Festival. By 11, he was being called a prodigy. Robert Carter worked double shifts to pay for better teachers, better opportunities. James's mother, Linda, drove him to lessons and competitions across the city. They sacrificed vacations, new clothes, nights out. Everything went toward James's music. And it was worth it. James flourished. He loved the piano with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He practiced 4, 5, 6 hours a day. While other kids were playing basketball or video games, James was at the piano, his fingers dancing across the keys, his mind lost in the mathematics and emotion of music. At 13, he performed with the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra. The conductor told Robert and Linda that their son had the potential to be one of the greats. Not just good, great. At 14, James auditioned for the Chicago High School for the Arts and was accepted with a full scholarship. He studied under renowned teachers who shaped his technique, refined his interpretation, pushed him to understand music not just as notes on a page, but as a living, breathing language. At 15, he gave his first solo recital at a small concert hall in downtown Chicago. 200 people came to hear him play. Among them were talent scouts from major music schools, critics from local papers, and musicians who'd performed with symphonies around the world. James played Beethoven, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and Liszt. He played for 90 minutes completely from memory, with technical precision and emotional depth that left the audience stunned. The Chicago Tribune ran a review the next day. The headline read, "Young pianist James Carter, a star in the making." Robert Carter framed that article and hung it in the living room. He told everyone he met about his son, the piano prodigy, the boy who was going to play in concert halls around the world. At 16, James auditioned for the Juilliard School in New York City, one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the world. He performed Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, the same piece he'd just played at Riverside Elementary. The audition panel sat in silence after he finished. Then, one by one, they began to applaud. James was accepted with a full scholarship. Full tuition room and board, everything covered. He would move to New York after graduating high school and study under masters of the craft. His future was set. His dreams were coming true. Robert Carter cried when they got the acceptance letter. His son, his brilliant son, was going to Juilliard, a kid from the south side of Chicago, whose father was a cop and whose mother worked at a grocery store, was going to one of the best music schools in the world. James graduated high school at 17, giving a farewell concert that packed the school auditorium. He played for 2 hours, showcasing everything he'd learned, everything he'd become. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. He had 1 summer left before leaving for New York. 1 summer to prepare for the next chapter of his life. 1 summer before everything changed forever. On July 15th, 2 weeks before James was supposed to leave for Juilliard, Robert Carter responded to a domestic disturbance call in a rough neighborhood on the west side. It should have been routine. He'd handled hundreds of similar calls over his 20-year career, but this time was different. This time there was a gun. Robert Carter was shot 3 times. He died before the ambulance arrived. James was at home practicing piano when his mother got the call from the police department. He heard her scream, heard the phone clatter to the floor, and he knew. Somehow he just knew. His father was gone. James was 17 years old, 2 weeks away from moving to New York, and his entire world collapsed. The funeral was held on a Thursday. Hundreds of people came. Fellow officers, neighbors, friends, students. Robert had mentored. They all talked about what a good man he'd been, how dedicated, how much he'd loved his family. James sat in the front row, numb, unable to process what had happened. His father, who'd sacrificed so much for him, who'd worked himself to exhaustion to give James opportunities, was gone. And James had never even thanked him properly. He'd been too focused on his music, his career, his future. After the funeral, Linda Carter collapsed. The stress, the grief, the shock. It was too much. She was hospitalized with what doctors called a nervous breakdown. She couldn't work. She couldn't function. She needed care. James was supposed to leave for Juilliard in 1 week. He sat at the piano in his house, the same battered upright his father had bought 12 years earlier, and he played. He played Rachmaninoff's Prelude, the piece that had earned him his Juilliard scholarship, the piece his father had loved more than any other. And as he played, James cried. He cried for his father. He cried for his mother. He cried for the future that was slipping away. Because James knew what he had to do. He knew what his father would have wanted him to do. He called Juilliard, and withdrew his acceptance. He gave up his scholarship, his dreams, his future. He stayed in Chicago to take care of his mother. At 17 years old, James Carter walked away from the piano and never looked back. Until tonight. The months after his father's death were the darkest of James's life. He got a job at a warehouse working nights to pay bills while taking care of his mother during the day. The piano sat in their living room, silent, gathering dust. James couldn't bring himself to play it. Every time he looked at it, he saw his father's proud smile, heard his father's voice saying, "That's my boy. That's my son, the concert pianist." Except James wasn't a concert pianist anymore. He was a warehouse worker trying to keep his family afloat. Linda slowly recovered, but she was never the same. The vibrant, energetic woman who'd driven James to competitions and cheered from the audience was gone, replaced by someone quieter, sadder, permanently wounded by loss. She told James to go to New York to reclaim his scholarship to follow his dreams. But James knew they couldn't afford it. Without his warehouse job, they'd lose the house. And more than that, his mother needed him. She was all he had left. When James turned 18, he made another decision. He joined the Chicago Police Department following in his father's footsteps. It felt like honoring Robert's memory, continuing his legacy. If James couldn't be a pianist, at least he could be what his father had been: a protector, a servant of the community, someone who made a difference. The police academy was grueling, but James threw himself into it with the same intensity he'd once applied to piano practice. He excelled in physical training, marksmanship, tactical scenarios. His instructors praised his focus and discipline. But at night, alone in his room, James felt hollow. Music had been his identity, his purpose, his language for understanding the world. Without it, he felt like a part of his soul was missing. He was 19 when he met Sarah Martinez. She was a waitress at a diner near the police station where James had been assigned after graduating from the academy. She was pretty funny and kind. She made James laugh for the first time since his father's death. They started dating. For a few months, James felt something like happiness again. Sarah didn't know about his piano background. He'd never told her. That part of his life felt too painful to discuss, like a wound that hadn't healed. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah got pregnant. She was 21, James was 19, and neither of them was ready for parenthood. But when Sarah suggested they could handle it together, that they could be a family, James agreed. He'd lost so much. Maybe this was his chance to build something new. Lily Carter was born on a cold November morning, 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through to James's soul. The moment the nurse placed his daughter in his arms, something shifted inside him. A fierce, protective love that he'd never experienced before flooded through him. This was his daughter. His responsibility, his purpose. Sarah stayed for 3 months after Lily was born. Then one morning, James woke up to find a note on the kitchen table. Sarah was gone. She'd left in the night, taking only her clothes and her car. The note said she couldn't do it, couldn't be a mother, couldn't handle the responsibility. She was sorry. She hoped he'd understand. James never heard from her again. At 19 years old, James became a single father. He worked patrol shifts while Linda watched Lily during the day. Money was tighter than ever. The warehouse job had paid better than rookie cop salary, but James couldn't give up his father's legacy. When Lily was 3 years old, Linda's health took a sudden turn. The cancer had been growing silently, undetected, until it was too late. She had months, maybe weeks. James took a leave of absence from the police department to care for her. Those final weeks, Linda held Lily in her arms and told James how proud she was of him, how Robert would have been proud too. "You gave up everything for us," she whispered one night. "The music, Juilliard, your dreams." "I didn't give up everything," James said, looking at Lily sleeping in a crib nearby. "I found something better." Linda smiled. "You're a good father, James, a good man. But promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll let her hear you play someday. Don't let that gift die completely. Your music was beautiful. She should know that her father was capable of beauty." James promised, though he knew he'd never keep that promise. The piano was the past. Lily was his future. Linda Carter died 2 weeks later with James and Lily by her side. James returned to the police department, working longer hours to make ends meet. He moved from Chicago to a smaller city where the cost of living was lower, where his salary could stretch further. He focused entirely on being the best father he could be. He helped with homework, packed lunches, attended every school event. He read bedtime stories and fixed scraped knees and taught Lily about kindness and integrity. He never touched a piano. He never listened to classical music. He locked that part of himself away so completely that sometimes he could almost forget it had ever existed. Lily grew into a smart, curious, compassionate girl. She was the best thing in James's life, the only thing that mattered. When she asked about his childhood, he told her stories about his father, the hero cop. He never mentioned Juilliard. He never mentioned the prodigy he'd once been. That life was gone, buried under years of sacrifice and duty and love. But talents like James's don't disappear completely. They hibernate waiting. And sometimes when circumstances align, they wake up again. James had chosen Riverside Elementary carefully. He'd researched schools for months looking for the best academic programs, the best teachers, the best opportunities for Lily. Riverside was expensive, stretching his budget to the breaking point, but it was worth it. Lily thrived there. Her grades were excellent. She loved learning. She came home every day excited about science projects, or history lessons, or books she'd discovered in the library. But she struggled socially. The other kids, with their designer clothes and vacation stories and casual references to things that cost more than James made in a month, made Lily feel different. She tried not to show it, but James could see the hurt in her eyes when she wasn't invited to birthday parties, when other girls whispered and excluded her, when boys made jokes about her father being just a cop. James did everything he could to make up for it. He volunteered at school events. He chaperoned field trips. He showed up to every parent-teacher conference, even when he had to take unpaid time off work. But he couldn't change who he was. He couldn't magically transform into a tech executive or lawyer or business owner. He was a cop, and in this community that meant he was less than. The fundraiser gala was supposed to be a chance for Lily to feel included. All the families would be there, and James had saved money for months to afford the ticket price. He'd bought a new shirt for the occasion, one without any frayed cuffs. He'd polished his only pair of dress shoes. He'd tried. But Victoria Sinclair and her circle of wealthy parents had made sure he knew it wasn't enough. They'd made sure everyone knew that James and Lily didn't belong. Sitting at that table, watching his daughter try not to cry, James had felt the old anger returning. The anger he'd felt when his father died. The anger he'd felt when Sarah left. The anger he'd felt every time life had taken something from him. But beneath the anger was something else. A memory of who he'd once been. A reminder that he'd once been exceptional at something, that he'd once had value beyond his job title or bank account. That's why he'd stood up when Victoria challenged him. That's why he'd walked to the piano. Not to prove anything to Victoria or the other parents, but to show Lily that her father was more than they thought. That worth wasn't measured in dollars or job titles. When his fingers had touched those keys, when the first notes of Rachmaninoff had filled the room, James had felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years. He'd felt like himself again. But he'd stopped. He'd pulled back before falling completely into the music, because he knew if he let himself feel it fully, if he let himself remember everything he'd lost, it might break him. The piano was his past. Lily was his future. He couldn't live in both worlds. Or so he'd thought. The fundraiser continued after James's incomplete performance, but the atmosphere had changed. People were whispering, exchanging glances, clearly confused about what they'd just witnessed. The cop, who wasn't supposed to know anything about culture, had just played a notoriously difficult piano piece with shocking proficiency. It didn't fit their narrative. Victoria seemed to sense this shift, and it made her angrier. Her entire power play had backfired. Instead of humiliating James, she'd inadvertently revealed that he was more than he appeared. That couldn't stand. She stood again, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Well, I suppose we should all applaud Officer Carter's effort." She clapped slowly, condescendingly. A few people joined her, but the applause was uncertain, confused. Of course, Victoria continued, actually finishing a piece is rather important in music, isn't it? Starting something you can't complete is worse than not starting at all. It shows a lack of follow-through, commitment. She was trying to regain control to reshape the narrative. Yes, he'd played well for a bit, but he couldn't finish. Therefore, he was still inferior. Patricia, Victoria's friend, joined in. "Quite right. My daughter's piano teacher always says that discipline and completion are the marks of a true musician. Playing a few impressive phrases doesn't mean much if you can't see it through." Another parent, a man named Gordon, who owned a hedge fund, added his voice. "I think what Victoria is trying to say kindly is that there's a difference between dabbling in something and truly mastering it. We've all taken a few piano lessons as children. That doesn't make us pianists." The conversation was turning consensus building. Yes, what James had played was surprisingly good, but it wasn't complete, wasn't polished, wasn't real. He was still the cop, pretending to be something he wasn't. Victoria moved closer to where James sat with Lily. Her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, Officer Carter, I think I understand what happened. You probably took some lessons as a child, learned a few pieces. Maybe you were even decent back then. But real musical skill requires constant practice, dedication, years of proper training. It requires resources that—" She looked around the room meaningfully. "That not everyone has access to." She was reframing his performance as a fluke, a remnant of childhood lessons, nothing more. The other parents nodded, accepting this explanation. It made sense. It allowed them to maintain their worldview. Lily looked up at her father, tears streaming down her face now. She'd been so proud when he played, so hopeful. Now Victoria was taking even that away, turning it into another reason for shame. "Maybe it's time we acknowledged that not every child belongs at Riverside," Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "It's not about discrimination. It's about fit. Some families can provide their children with the advantages needed to thrive here. Others—" She looked directly at Lily. "Others might be happier at schools more suited to their circumstances." She was threatening them, making clear that if James didn't accept his place, if he didn't back down, Victoria would use her influence to make things difficult for Lily at school. James felt something crystallize inside him. He'd walked away from the piano 8 years ago to protect his family, to do his duty, to make responsible choices. He'd sacrificed his dreams without complaint, because that's what fathers do. But watching his daughter cry, seeing her spirit being crushed by these callous, cruel people, James realized that sometimes duty means standing up, not backing down. Sometimes responsibility means showing your child that you don't let bullies win, no matter how wealthy or powerful they are. He'd stopped playing earlier because he was afraid. Afraid of the memories, the pain, the reminder of everything he'd lost. But Lily was losing something right now. Her confidence, her sense of worth, her belief that her father was someone special. James stood up. The room fell silent again. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said quietly, "you're right about one thing. Real musical skill requires dedication and years of training. It requires sacrifice." Victoria's smile returned. He was conceding, accepting his place. But you're wrong about something else. James continued. You're wrong about what I am and what I'm not. He turned to Mr. Harrison, the principal. Sir, would you mind if I played one more time a complete performance this time? Mr. Harrison looked between James and Victoria, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but he nodded. Of course, Officer Carter. James looked down at Lily. Sweetheart, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Lily wiped her tears, looking up at him with confusion and hope mixed together. I didn't just take a few piano lessons when I was a kid, James said softly. Music was my whole life once. I was going to be a concert pianist. I had a scholarship to Juilliard, one of the best music schools in the world. But then Grandpa died, and Grandma got sick, and you came along, and I had to make a choice. I chose family. I chose responsibility. I chose you. Lily's eyes widened. You were going to be a concert pianist, I was, James said. But being your father is better than any career I could have had. I don't regret my choice. Not for a second. He looked up at Victoria, and his expression hardened. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to play. James walked back to the piano. This time his steps were different, more confident, more purposeful. He wasn't approaching the instrument as a cop trying to prove something. He was approaching it as the pianist he'd once been. He sat down at the bench and positioned his hands over the keys. You wanted me to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. You want a complete performance. He paused, his eyes meeting Victoria's. You'll get one. Before James could begin, Victoria held up her hand, unable to resist one final attempt to maintain control. She'd built her entire identity around being superior, around having access to things others didn't, around belonging to a class that mere civil servants could never enter. James's revelation about Juilliard threatened that identity. She needed to discredit him one more time. Wait, she said, standing and addressing the room. I think we all deserve some context here. Officer Carter, you claim you had a scholarship to Juilliard. That's quite a claim. She moved to the center of the room, every inch the corporate executive skilled at presentations and manipulation. Juilliard accepts fewer than 7% of applicants. It's one of the most elite music conservatories in the world. And you expect us to believe that you, a police officer who lives in a modest apartment and drives a 10-year-old car, turned down a spot there. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Victoria was framing it as a lie, a fabrication designed to save face after his incomplete performance. If you truly had such talent, Victoria continued, why would you be working as a police officer? Why wouldn't you have found a way to make music your career? No one with real extraordinary talent would just walk away from it. She was good at this, James had to admit. She was planting doubt, making his story sound implausible. The wealthy parents who'd never had to make sacrifices, who'd never had to choose between dreams and duty, found her logic compelling. They nodded along. Gordon, the hedge fund manager, spoke up. She has a point, Carter. If you were really that good, there would have been scholarships, grants, ways to make it work. People with real talent find a way. James felt his jaw tighten. These people had no idea what it was like to make impossible choices with limited resources. They'd never had to choose between pursuing their dreams and taking care of dying parents. They'd never had to raise a child alone on a civil servant's salary. But before he could respond, a voice came from the back of the room. He's telling the truth. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez, the music teacher, walking forward. She held her phone in her hand. I just looked it up, she said, her voice shaking slightly. She was clearly nervous about contradicting Victoria, but she continued anyway. James Carter from Chicago, accepted to Juilliard School of Music 18 years ago with a full scholarship. I found an article from the Chicago Tribune about it. There's even a photo. She held up her phone, showing a faded newspaper article. A 17-year-old James, smiling beside a piano, the headline reading "Southside Prodigy Earns Full Ride to Juilliard." The room went silent. Victoria's face paled. Mrs. Rodriguez continued, her confidence growing. The article says he was considered one of the most promising young pianists in the Midwest, that he'd won multiple competitions and had performed with the Chicago Youth Symphony, that music scouts were calling him a future star. She looked at James with something like awe. "You really were that good?" James nodded slowly. "I was. But talent doesn't pay bills. Talent doesn't take care of sick parents or infant daughters. I made the choice I had to make." Victoria, sensing her position crumbling, made one last, desperate play. "Fine. You had talent once. But that was almost 2 decades ago. You said yourself you haven't played in 8 years. Muscle memory fades. Skills deteriorate. Whatever you once were, that doesn't mean—" "Then let's find out," James interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "You wanted me to play Rachmaninoff. You wanted a complete performance. Let me give you one." He turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. "You're a trained musician. You know piano. Would you say Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor is a difficult piece?" Mrs. Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "It's one of the most technically demanding pieces in the standard repertoire. Most professional pianists struggle with it. The control required, the dynamics, the emotional interpretation. It's extremely challenging." James looked back at Victoria. "There's your standard. If I play it completely perfectly, will you accept that maybe, just maybe, you've been wrong about me, about my daughter, about who deserves respect and who doesn't?" Victoria's face was flushed now, her composure slipping. She'd backed herself into a corner. If she refused, she'd look afraid. If she agreed, and James succeeded, she'd be publicly humiliated. Pride won out. "Fine," she said sharply. "Play your piece. Let's see if you're as good as you claim." James turned back to the piano. His hands were steady, now calm. The fear and doubt from earlier had burned away, replaced by something else. Not anger, not even determination. Something closer to peace. He was going to do this. Not for Victoria. Not for the other parents. Not even to prove anything to himself. He was going to do this for Lily, so she could see who her father really was. So she could understand that worth comes from character, from sacrifice, from love. Not from money or status or the approval of people like Victoria Sinclair. This piece, James said, quietly speaking to the room, but looking at his daughter, is called The Prelude in C-sharp minor. Rachmaninoff wrote it when he was 19 years old. It made him famous, but it also became a burden. For the rest of his life, people demanded he play it at every concert. He grew to resent it, this piece that defined him. He positioned his hands over the keys. I used to feel similarly. This was my signature piece, the one everyone wanted to hear. I played it at my Juilliard audition. I played it at my last concert before I walked away from music. It represented everything I was giving up. His fingers touched the keys. But tonight it means something different. Tonight it represents everything I chose instead. My father, my mother, my daughter. The life I built from sacrifice and love. He looked up one more time, his eyes finding Lily in the audience. This is for you, sweetheart. So you never doubt that your father is someone special. Not because I can play piano, but because I chose you over everything else. The opening chords of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor rang out. But this time, they were different. This time, James wasn't holding back. He wasn't stopping himself from falling completely into the music. The famous 3-note motif, those deep, resonant bells, filled the auditorium with power and purpose. James's hands moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who'd played this piece hundreds of times, who knew every phrase, every dynamic, every subtle shift of emotion. The room was completely silent except for the music. No whispers now, no smirks. Every person was transfixed. Victoria stood frozen near her table, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. She was watching James's hands fly across the keyboard, watching him execute passages that her son couldn't play after years of expensive lessons, and the reality was crashing down around her. She'd miscalculated. Badly. Bradley Sinclair stared at James with his mouth slightly open. He'd been playing piano since he was 4 years old. He practiced an hour every day with a teacher who charged $200 per lesson. And he couldn't play like this. He couldn't even comprehend playing like this. The prelude moved through its first major section, alternating between the powerful, almost violent chords and the more delicate, introspective passages. James navigated every shift perfectly, his technique flawless, his interpretation mature and deeply felt. This wasn't a rusty amateur trying to remember old skills. This was a master performing at the peak of his abilities. Mrs. Rodriguez stood near the wall, tears streaming down her face. She'd studied music her entire life, had dreamed of being a concert pianist herself before settling into teaching. She recognized what she was witnessing. This was the kind of talent that came along once in a generation, the kind of talent that should have been performing at Carnegie Hall, not at an elementary school fundraiser. What a waste, she thought. What a tragic waste. But then she looked at Lily watching her father with shining eyes, and she reconsidered. Maybe it wasn't a waste. Maybe some things were more important than career achievements and fame. The prelude continued building in intensity. James's face was peaceful now, almost serene. For the first time in 8 years, he was home. He was speaking his native language again, the language of music that had once defined his entire existence. Memories flooded through him as he played. His father sitting in the audience at his concerts, beaming with pride. His mother driving him to lessons and competitions without complaint. Mrs. Chen, his first teacher, who'd seen something special in a 5-year-old boy and nurtured it. The Juilliard acceptance letter. The newspaper articles. The dreams of concert tours and recording contracts, and a life spent in pursuit of beauty and expression. All of it sacrificed. All of it given up for duty and responsibility and love. For so long, James had thought of that sacrifice as a loss, as something taken from him. But as he played now, he understood it differently. The music hadn't been taken from him. He'd given it freely, willingly, because there were things more important than personal achievement. His father had been one of those things. His mother had been one of those things. And Lily, his beautiful daughter, was worth more than every concert he might have performed, every recording he might have made, every accolade he might have earned. The prelude reached its middle section, the contemplative, almost mournful portion, where the melody becomes quieter, more introspective. James played it with such tenderness that several people in the audience began to cry. He was pouring his entire story into the music. His loss, his grief, his sacrifice, his love. Gordon, the hedge fund manager who'd questioned James earlier, felt something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He'd spent his entire adult life pursuing wealth, measuring his worth by his portfolio and his possessions. But listening to this music, feeling the raw emotion in every phrase, he suddenly wondered if he'd missed something essential about what it meant to be human. Patricia, Victoria's friend, thought about her own children, how she'd hired tutors and coaches and trainers to give them every advantage, but couldn't remember the last time she'd sacrificed anything meaningful for them. She paid people to spend time with her kids, so she wouldn't have to. One by one, the people in that room were confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, truths revealed by the music pouring from James Carter's hands. The prelude built toward its climax, the technical difficulty ramping up exponentially. This was the section where most pianists made mistakes, where the demands of the piece exceeded their abilities. James played it perfectly. His fingers flew across the keys in rapid passages, stretching across octaves, executing trills and runs that required absolute control. The sound filled every corner of the auditorium, powerful and overwhelming. Victoria Sinclair felt something she hadn't felt in years: shame. Real, crushing shame. She'd spent the entire evening mocking this man, dismissing him, treating him like he was beneath her. And now she was being forced to confront the fact that he possessed gifts. She couldn't buy talents that money couldn't acquire, depths of character she couldn't comprehend. She wanted to leave to flee the auditorium and escape this moment, but she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped by her own arrogance, forced to witness her own humiliation. The music continued building and building toward the final crescendo. James's hands pounded the keys with controlled power, each chord resonating through the room like thunder. This was the climax, the moment when everything came together, when all the preceding phrases resolved into overwhelming catharsis. Lily gripped the edge of her chair, watching her father with tears streaming down her face. This was her daddy. The man who packed her lunches and helped with her homework and read her bedtime stories. And he could do this. He could create beauty so powerful it made people cry. She'd never doubted that he was special. But now, everyone else knew it too. The final section approached. James moved into the coda, the ending phrases that would complete the piece. His hands moved across the keys with absolute confidence, every note precise, every dynamic perfect. The last chord rang out deep and resonant, hanging in the air for a long moment before fading into silence. James's hands remained on the keys, his head bowed, breathing deeply. He'd done it. He'd played the piece completely flawlessly for the first time in 8 years. For 3 seconds, the auditorium was completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Then from the back of the room, someone began to clap. The applause started slowly, uncertainly from the back of the auditorium. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first, her hands coming together with genuine enthusiasm, tears still streaming down her face. She knew what she'd just witnessed. This was professional-level performance, the kind she'd only heard on recordings by world-renowned pianists. Within seconds, others joined. Mr. Harrison stood and applauded. Then a parent near the middle stood. Then another. Then another. Within 10 seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet in a standing ovation that echoed off the walls and ceiling. Parents who minutes ago had been mocking James now clapped with genuine respect, some with tears in their own eyes. They'd been moved, despite themselves, touched by music that transcended their prejudices and assumptions. James stood slowly from the piano bench, somewhat dazed. He'd lost himself completely in the performance, fallen so deeply into the music that he'd almost forgotten where he was. The applause brought him back to reality. He looked out at the audience, at all these people standing and clapping, and for a moment he didn't know how to react. This wasn't the Carnegie Hall debut he'd once dreamed of. This was an elementary school fundraiser in a suburban auditorium. But the response was real, the emotion genuine. His eyes found Lily. She was standing at their table, clapping harder than anyone, her face glowing with pride and joy. That made it all worthwhile. The applause continued for nearly a minute, genuine and sustained. Finally, it began to taper off as people sat back down, though the murmur of excited conversation immediately filled the space. "That was incredible," someone said nearby. "I've never heard anything like that," said another. He should be performing professionally, a woman whispered to her husband. Why is he working as a cop? Gordon, the hedge fund manager, turned to the person next to him and said, I've been to concerts at Symphony Hall. That was as good as anything I've heard there. Patricia pulled out her phone, frantically searching for information about James. She found the old Chicago Tribune article. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned the photograph of a teenage James Carter beside the headline about Juilliard. Oh my God, she whispered to Victoria. It's all true. He was a prodigy. He really turned down Juilliard. But Victoria wasn't listening. She stood near her table, her face pale, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. She was staring at James like she'd seen a ghost. Everything she'd said, every mocking comment, every dismissive gesture was echoing in her mind now. She'd humiliated herself. Completely. Publicly. Irreversibly. James walked back toward his table, and the crowd parted for him like he was royalty. People nodded respectfully as he passed. Some reached out to shake his hand, offering congratulations he accepted with quiet grace. When he reached Lily, she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. Daddy, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You were amazing. James knelt down to her level, smiling. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm sorry I never told you about this part of my life. Why didn't you, Lily asked, her eyes still shining with tears. Why did you stop playing? Because James said softly, being your dad is more important than playing piano. I had to make a choice, and I chose you. I'd make the same choice again. Lily hugged him tighter. Can you teach me to play like that? James laughed, kissing the top of her head. If you want to learn, absolutely. But you don't have to be a pianist to be special, Lily. You're already special just by being you. Mr. Harrison approached them, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. Officer Carter, I had no idea. That was extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. Thank you, James said simply. Have you considered performing professionally, teaching perhaps? With talent like that? I have a career, James interrupted gently. I'm a police officer and a father. That's enough for me. Mrs. Rodriguez joined them, still wiping tears from her eyes. Mr. Carter, I teach music. I've been teaching for 20 years. What you just did, that's not something that can be learned. That's pure talent. You could have been one of the greats, could have been... James agreed. But I'm not, and that's okay. Some paths we don't take because better paths open up. He squeezed Lily's hand. This is my path, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. More parents approached, offering compliments and congratulations. Some apologized indirectly for their earlier attitudes. Others asked questions about his background, his training, his story. James answered politely, but briefly, not interested in making this moment about himself. Through it all, Victoria remained near her table, isolated now in a way she'd never experienced before. Her friends had drifted away suddenly, very interested in conversations with other people. No one wanted to be associated with her after her very public, very brutal misjudgment. Bradley stood beside his mother, looking confused and embarrassed. He'd heard her mock James Carter all evening, had participated in the assumption that a cop couldn't possibly have culture or talent. Now he felt ashamed. His own piano performance, which had seemed so impressive earlier, felt hollow and mechanical in comparison to what James had just played. Patricia finally approached Victoria, her voice low. Victoria, I think we need to. Don't, Victoria snapped. I don't want to hear it. But Patricia continued anyway. You made a mistake, a big one. We all did really, but you were the most vocal. You need to apologize. Victoria's jaw clenched. Everything in her resisted the idea. She was Victoria Sinclair. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit mistakes. Her entire identity was built on being right, being superior, being untouchable. But looking around the room, seeing how the other parents were now treating James with respect, while studiously avoiding her, Victoria realized she had no choice. Her social standing in this community depended on how she handled the next few minutes. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her designer dress, and walked toward James and Lily. Each step felt like walking to an execution. Her pride screamed at her to turn around, to leave, to find some way to salvage the situation without admitting fault. But there was no other way. She'd been wrong. Publicly, dramatically, completely wrong. James saw her approaching and straightened his expression, neutral. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. Why should he? Victoria stopped a few feet away, very aware that people were watching, listening. The room had gone quiet again, sensing drama. "Officer Carter," she began, her voice tight. I owe you an apology." The words felt like glass in her mouth. She forced herself to continue. "I made assumptions about you based on your profession and your circumstances. Those assumptions were wrong. Clearly." She gestured vaguely toward the piano. "You have extraordinary talent. I shouldn't have mocked you. I shouldn't have suggested you didn't belong here." It was an apology, technically, but it was cold, mechanical, offered more out of social necessity than genuine remorse. James looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Mrs. Sinclair, I don't need your apology, but my daughter does." He put his hand on Lily's shoulder. "You didn't just insult me tonight. You made my 8-year-old daughter feel like she didn't belong, like she wasn't good enough, like her father's profession made her less than the other children. That's what you should be sorry for." Victoria's face flushed red. She looked down at Lily, who was staring up at her with those large, dark eyes, and for the first time that evening, Victoria felt something like genuine shame. "You're right," she said, and this time her voice was softer. "Lily, I'm sorry. I was cruel, and you didn't deserve that. Neither did your father." Lily looked up at James, uncertain how to respond. James squeezed her shoulder gently. "What do you think, sweetie? Can you accept Mrs. Sinclair's apology?" Lily considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but she has to mean it." Victoria knelt down, putting herself at Lily's eye level. It was a gesture that cost her considerable pride. "I do mean it. I was wrong about your father. He's clearly a remarkable man." Lily nodded again, satisfied. "He is. He's the best dad in the world." Victoria stood feeling dismissed and somehow smaller than when she'd approached. She'd apologized, but she hadn't been forgiven. Not really. Acceptance wasn't forgiveness. James nodded to her. "Thank you for the apology. I hope tonight taught you something about making assumptions." Victoria nodded stiffly and returned to her table where Bradley was waiting. She sat down heavily, feeling exhausted. Around her, the fundraiser was winding down, people preparing to leave, still buzzing about James's performance. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. That took courage. "But you know you'll be the talk of every parent group tomorrow, right?" Victoria closed her eyes. Yes, she knew. By tomorrow, every parent at Riverside would know how Victoria Sinclair had tried to humiliate a police officer at the fundraiser and had been spectacularly proven wrong. Some would be sympathetic. Most would be amused. A few would see it as an opportunity to undermine her influence in the school's social hierarchy. She'd made herself vulnerable, and in her world, vulnerability was blood in the water. But more than the social implications, something else bothered Victoria. Something she couldn't quite name. Watching James play, seeing the love in his eyes when he looked at his daughter, hearing him say that being a father was more important than any career, Victoria tried to remember the last time she'd sacrificed anything for Bradley. She worked long hours building her real estate empire. She hired people to drive Bradley to his activities, to help with homework, to attend his performances when she was too busy. She bought him everything he wanted, enrolled him in the best programs, gave him every advantage money could buy. But had she ever given him herself? Her time, her presence, her sacrifice? The question made her uncomfortable, so she pushed it away. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through emails, retreating into work, into the world she understood and controlled. Some lessons were too painful to learn in a single evening. The fundraiser ended shortly after James's performance. People began filtering out of the auditorium, but many stopped to speak with James first. Some asked about his background, genuinely curious now. Others complimented his playing. A few apologized indirectly for their earlier coldness. James handled each interaction with grace, answering questions politely while keeping Lily close to his side. He could see she was tired, emotionally drained from the evening's roller coaster. He wanted to get her home, away from this place and these people. As they were preparing to leave, Mrs. Rodriguez approached them one more time. "Mr. Carter, I know you said you're happy with your career, but I have to ask, would you ever consider doing a workshop for our music students? Not performing necessarily, but talking to them about dedication and discipline, about what real mastery looks like." James considered it. "I don't know if that's a good idea. Tonight was unusual. I don't normally play anymore. But you could." Mrs. Rodriguez pressed. "That talent doesn't just disappear. And these kids, they think talent is something you're born with, something easy. They don't understand the work required, the sacrifice. You could teach them that." James glanced down at Lily, who was looking up at him hopefully. She clearly liked the idea of her father being involved with the school in this new capacity, being recognized for something extraordinary rather than just being the cop dad. "I'll think about it," James said finally. "But I make no promises." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "That's all I ask. Thank you again for tonight. You gave everyone here a gift, whether they deserve it or not." As she walked away, Mr. Harrison approached. The principal looked uncomfortable. "Officer Carter, I want you to know that what happened here tonight, the way some of our parents treated you, that's not acceptable. Riverside Elementary prides itself on inclusivity and respect." James raised an eyebrow. "Does it? Because from what I've seen, this school has a pretty clear hierarchy based on wealth and status." Mr. Harrison flinched. We try to foster a welcoming environment for all families." "You might want to try harder," James said, not unkindly. "Lily's not the only kid here who doesn't come from money. And she's not the only one who feels like she doesn't belong. Maybe address that at your next parent meeting." "I will," Mr. Harrison said, nodding. "And Officer Carter, I'm glad you played tonight. I think a lot of people learned something important." "I hope so," James said, "for Lily's sake." They finally made it out of the auditorium and into the parking lot. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the stuffiness inside. James unlocked his old Ford sedan and helped Lily into her seat, making sure her seatbelt was fastened. As he walked around to the driver's side, he saw Victoria standing beside her luxury SUV watching him. Their eyes met for a moment. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but James just nodded and got into his car. Some conversations didn't need to happen. The drive home was quiet for the first few minutes. Lily stared out the window, processing everything that had happened. Finally, she spoke. "Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me about the piano? About Juilliard?" James glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "It's complicated, sweetheart. That was a different life a long time ago. I didn't want you to think I regretted giving it up for you." "Do you?" Lily asked softly. Regret it? No, James said, immediately firmly. Not even a little bit. Lily, I want you to understand something. Before you were born, piano was the most important thing in my life. I thought it defined me, that it was what made me special. He pulled up to a red light and turned to look at her directly. But then you came along and I realized I was wrong. Being your dad, watching you grow up, helping you become the amazing person you are, that's what makes me special. Not playing piano, not any career I might have had. You. Lily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were happy tears. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know. The light turned green, and James continued driving toward their modest apartment. It wasn't much, but it was home. It was theirs. Will you play again? Lily asked. At home, James thought about it. For 8 years, he'd avoided the piano, treating it like a painful memory best left alone. But tonight had changed something. Playing again hadn't destroyed him. Instead, it had reminded him that the music was still part of him, still something he could access when he chose to. Maybe he said, "If you want to learn, I could teach you. We'd need to find a cheap keyboard somewhere, but we could manage." "I'd like that," Lily said. "But Daddy, I don't want to be a concert pianist. I just want to play for fun." James smiled. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Music should be fun. It should be joy, not pressure." They pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex. As James helped Lily out of the car, she suddenly asked another question. "Why were those people so mean, Messa?" Sinclair and the others James knelt down beside her, thinking carefully about his answer. Some people measure worth by money and status. They think if you don't have those things, you're less important. But they're wrong, Lily. Worth comes from character, from how you treat people, from the choices you make when things are hard. Like you choosing to be my dad instead of a famous pianist. Exactly like that, James said, smiling. Some choices are hard because they require giving up something you want for something you need. I needed to be your dad more than I wanted to be a pianist. Lily hugged him tightly. Those people don't understand. No, James agreed. They don't. But maybe tonight taught them a little bit about not judging people by appearances. They walked up to their apartment, a modest 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor. It had worn carpet and outdated appliances, but Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator and photographs of happy moments filled the shelves. It was full of love, even if it wasn't full of luxury. James helped Lily get ready for bed, listening, as she brushed her teeth and changed into pajamas. When she climbed under her covers, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy at school tomorrow. Will things be different?" James sat on the edge of her bed. "Maybe. Some kids might treat you better now that they know about the piano. But Lily, I need you to understand something important. Your worth doesn't come from what I can do or what I used to be. It comes from who you are." "I know," Lily said. "You taught me that." "Good, don't forget it. And if anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. We'll handle it together." Lily nodded, then yawned widely. The evening had exhausted her. James kissed her forehead and turned out the light, leaving only her nightlight glowing in the corner. Daddy, Lily called as he reached the door. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. For playing tonight. For showing everyone." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm proud of you too, Lily. For being brave tonight. For being kind, even when others weren't. You're a better person than I am." "That's not true," Lily said sleepily. "You're the best person I know." James stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his daughter drift off to sleep, and felt a profound sense of peace. He'd given up a lot to be here in this small apartment with its worn carpet and modest furniture. He'd sacrificed dreams and opportunities and a future that might have been extraordinary. But looking at Lily, seeing her safe and loved and growing into a wonderful young person, James knew he'd made the right choice. Not just the responsible choice or the dutiful choice, but the right one. Some paths we don't take because better paths open up. He'd told Mrs. Rodriguez that, and he'd meant it. This path, the one of fatherhood and duty and quiet heroism, was better than any concert stage. He closed Lily's door and walked to his own small room. Tomorrow he'd wake up early for his patrol shift. Tomorrow, life would return to normal. But tonight had changed. Something had reminded him that his past wasn't something to be ashamed of or buried. He'd been extraordinary once. He could be extraordinary again, in different ways, through different choices. As James prepared for bed, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it. "Officer Carter, this is Patricia Blackwell. I got your number from the school directory. I wanted to apologize again for tonight properly this time. You handled Victoria's cruelty with more grace than she deserved. If you're ever interested in performing at other events, I'd be honored to host. Also, my daughter Emily is in Lily's class. I'm going to talk to her about being a better friend. Our children shouldn't repeat our mistakes." Patricia James stared at the message for a moment, then typed a simple reply. "Thank you. Lily would appreciate a friend." He set his phone down and climbed into bed, exhausted but satisfied. Tonight had been difficult, painful in some ways, but ultimately good. He'd stood up for his daughter. He'd shown her that worth isn't measured by others' opinions. He'd reminded himself that his sacrifices had meaning. As he drifted off to sleep, James's last thought was of his father, Robert Carter, the cop who'd worked double shifts to pay for piano lessons, who'd sacrificed so much to give his son opportunities. "I get it now, Dad," James whispered to the darkness. "I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. Some things are worth more than dreams." In the days that followed, the fundraiser life at Riverside Elementary changed in small but significant ways. Victoria Sinclair became noticeably quieter at school events, her usual commanding presence muted by embarrassment. Some parents distanced themselves from her, while others seemed to take the incident as a cautionary tale about assumptions and prejudice. Bradley Sinclair, surprising everyone including his mother, approached Lily at lunch one day and apologized for not being friendlier. He asked if she wanted to sit with him and his friends. Lily, remembering her father's lessons about grace and second chances, said yes. Patricia's daughter Emily became one of Lily's closest friends, and Patricia herself began advocating for more inclusive policies at the school. She started a scholarship fund for families who struggled with tuition, inspired by the realization that wealth didn't equal worth, Mr. Harrison implemented new training for staff about unconscious bias and class discrimination. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Mrs. Rodriguez convinced James to do a single workshop for her advanced music students where he talked about discipline, sacrifice, and the difference between talent and mastery. The students listened with rapt attention, many of them seeing their own instrument practice in a new light afterward. And James, true to his word, bought a used keyboard from a pawn shop and began teaching Lily to play. They practiced together in the evenings after homework and dinner. Lily wasn't a prodigy like her father had been, but she loved the music, and that was enough. One evening, about a month after the fundraiser, James and Lily sat at the keyboard together, working through a simple Bach prelude. Lily's fingers stumbled over the notes, and she laughed in frustration. "I'm terrible at this," she said. "You're not terrible," James corrected gently. "You're learning. That's different." "Were you ever bad at piano?" Lily asked. James thought back to being 5 years old, pressing random keys on his father's yard sale upright. Everyone's bad at the beginning, but I loved it so much that I didn't care about being bad. I just wanted to keep playing. Do you love it again? Lily asked. Now that you're playing, James considered the question carefully. I love sharing it with you. That's different from what it used to be, but maybe better. Lily smiled and turned back to the keyboard, trying the Bach prelude again. This time she made it through the first line without mistakes. She looked up at James with delight, and he felt his heart swell with pride. This was better than Carnegie Hall. This was better than any concert, any recording, any accolade he might have earned. This was real. This was love. This was legacy. The story of James Carter and the Riverside Elementary fundraiser spread beyond the school, as these stories often do. It became one of those tales people told to illustrate a point about assumptions, about hidden depths, about the complexity of human choices. Some people focused on the dramatic moment of the performance, the spectacular vindication of an underestimated man. But those who understood the deeper meaning saw something else. They saw a story about sacrifice and love, about a man who'd given up extraordinary dreams to do ordinary things extraordinarily well. James never performed publicly again after that night. He didn't need to. He'd made his point, shown his daughter what he needed to show her, and that was enough. The piano returned to being a private joy, something shared between father and daughter in the quiet evenings of their modest apartment. Years later, when Lily was in college, a professor asked her to write an essay about someone who'd influenced her life. She wrote about her father, the cop, who'd once been a concert pianist who'd given up everything to raise her alone. She wrote, "My father taught me that worth isn't measured by what you achieve, but by what you sacrifice for the people you love." He could have been famous. He could have been wealthy. Instead, he chose to be my dad. And that choice, that sacrifice, makes him more extraordinary than any concert performance ever could. The professor gave her an A+ and wrote at the top of the essay, "Beautiful. Your father sounds like a remarkable man." Lily brought the essay home to show James. He read it sitting at their old kitchen table, and when he finished, his eyes were wet with tears. "You didn't have to write about me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course I did," Lily replied, hugging him tightly. "You're my hero, Dad. Not because you can play piano, because you chose me." James hugged his daughter and thought about all the choices he'd made, all the paths he hadn't taken. He thought about the 17-year-old boy who'd turned down Juilliard, the 19-year-old who'd become a cop, the 20-year-old who'd chosen to raise his daughter alone. Every choice had led him here to this moment, with his brilliant daughter telling him he was her hero. And he realized that Mrs. Rodriguez had been wrong. His talent hadn't been wasted. It had just been redirected. He'd once thought music was his gift to the world. But he'd been wrong. Lily was his gift to the world. Raising her with love and integrity and the understanding that worth comes from character, not circumstances. That was his masterpiece. Not Rachmaninoff's prelude in C-sharp minor, as beautiful as it was, but a young woman who knew kindness mattered more than status, who understood that true success wasn't measured in dollars or accolades, who'd learned from her father that some things were worth more than dreams. That evening, after Lily had gone to her room to study, James sat at the keyboard and played quietly. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but something simpler. A gentle melody he composed on the spot, just for himself, just for the joy of it. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He had something better. He had a daughter who loved him. He had a life built on sacrifice and integrity. He had the knowledge that when faced with impossible choices, he'd chosen correctly. The music floated through their small apartment, beautiful and fleeting, like all the best things in life. And James Carter, the cop, who'd once been a prodigy, the single father who'd given up everything, smiled and kept playing. Because some gifts aren't meant for concert halls. Some gifts are meant for home, for family, for the quiet moments when no one's watching and nothing's at stake except love. And those gifts, James had learned, are the ones that matter most. This story makes us think about the people in our own lives. How many times have we made assumptions about someone based on their job, their clothes, their zip code? How many extraordinary people have we dismissed because they didn't fit our expectations? James Carter's story reminds us that worth and talent don't always announce themselves. Sometimes the most remarkable people are the ones living quietly, sacrificing, privately choosing duty over recognition. Everyone has a story. The janitor, the waitress, the cop, the cashier. They all have depths we can't see, dreams they've set aside, talents they've sacrificed for reasons we don't understand. Before you judge someone, before you make assumptions about their worth or capabilities, remember James Carter. Remember that the person you're dismissing might have given up extraordinary things for ordinary love. That they might possess gifts they've chosen not to display. And remember this, the measure of a person isn't what they could have been, but what they chose to become, despite the options available to them. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider your own assumptions and prejudices, share it. Leave a comment about a time when you underestimated someone or were underestimated yourself. Subscribe to hear more stories about extraordinary people living ordinary lives. Because these are the stories that matter. Not the famous or the wealthy or the celebrated, but the ones who sacrifice, quietly love deeply, and choose integrity over accolades. James Carter isn't famous. He never will be. But he's a better man than most who are, and his daughter knows it. That's legacy enough.